Okay, everyone, and welcome to our third lecture in the Mindset Lecture Series presented by the Center for Psychedelic Psychotherapy and Trauma Research at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai. Glad you can join us. I'm Rachel Yehuda. Today, it is my really great pleasure to introduce our speakers, Michael and Annie Mithoefer. These are two of my favorite humans on the planet, and I've learned more about psychotherapy and psychedelics from them than anyone else. And in fact, they are the true inspiration behind why the center is called Psychedelic Psychotherapy. Dr. Mithoefer is board certified in psychiatry, emergency medicine, and internal medicine. And he is the senior medical director for medical affairs, training, and supervision at MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. And Annie Mithoefer, BSN, has 25 years experience working with trauma patients as a nurse and a psychotherapist, and is now focused primarily on training and supervision of therapists who are conducting MAPS-sponsored clinical trials. And because of their critical involvement in developing this treatment, we thought that you would love to hear from them. You heard from Dr. Rick Doblin a couple of months ago telling you the data of the clinical trials. But now we're going to go a little bit deeper. What actually happens in the psychotherapy part? We get giving somebody a medicine, but what do the therapists actually do? And that's what we're going to talk about today. You are invited to listen. There will be a lot of time for discussion. So again, I'm going to turn it over to Michael and Annie. We had the great pleasure of having them train us at the VA for an entire week. So it's great to have you back. And if you were there, you know how life transforming it is to receive this kind of instruction and watch the masters at work. And if you haven't, and this is your first exposure, enjoy it. And over to you.
Thank you so much, Rachel.
Thank you, Rachel. So good to be here.
Yeah, great to see you. It's been, we've so enjoyed getting to know you over the last few years, and really excited about what you've done there to have your center opening. So it's really fun to be able to share a little bit about the research. And we've also really enjoyed the two trainings where a lot of your team has come. So it's been really fun to get to know some of your team. So it's, and we're New York State people originally, even though we've been in the South for 40 years. So it feels like a really special connection. And I was thinking about it. Another connection we have to Mount Sinai is I was a medical monitor for the trials I didn't work on in phase 2, but Julie Holland was the medical monitor for the trials where I was the investigator, and she trained there, of course. So it feels like a nice connection. So
yeah.
So
just before we start with the slides, well, hello everyone. We rescued two 13-year-old dogs this week. So if you see me pop up, that means I've taken them out of the room and I'll be back. But hopefully they'll stay settled down.
They're chilling nicely in their beds right now. So we'll hope for the best.
Yeah.
So I'm going to share my screen. So we're going to talk a little bit about our research, of course, and we're going to go quite quickly through the background. I know that Rick Doblin and also Natalie Goldberg have already spoken, so some of you have heard about this, but we are going to do a quick review of kind of where we are with the research and what's been going on, so bring everybody up to speed. But I'll go quickly through that. A lot has been published about it now, so you can read the details if you want to, and then we'll have time to talk a little bit about the therapy and what happens in the therapy, and then we want to have plenty of time for discussions afterwards. So please hold your comments and questions, but we want to have lots of that once we finish this part. Let's see. So Annie and I both received salary from MAPS Public Benefit Corporation. And we also are on the Scientific Advisory Board of Awaken Life Sciences in the UK. I want to remind everybody that MDMA is still an investigational drug. We're talking about research, not clinical use yet. And of course, it has risks as well as possible benefits. I think this model of therapy and treatment is really fascinating. I also think the MAPS model of drug development is really an interesting one because it's a nonprofit model. The MAPS Public Benefit Corporation runs the research. Its only shareholder is the MAPS 501c3 nonprofit. So if MDMA is approved and there's income from selling it, for one thing, that the emphasis will be on public benefit, not maximizing profit, but also any profit there is will all go back to the nonprofit mission, not to any individual. So I like that model. Great gratitude for all the people that make this possible. This is only a portion of them now. The organization has grown a lot since this picture was taken a couple of years ago. And of course, appreciation for all the participants and all the donors that made this possible without any government or industry funding. So I'm going to give a brief review and overview of MDMA, and then we'll talk more about the therapeutic approach we use, how it kind of overlaps and differs from other kinds of therapy, and kind of our thoughts about the therapeutic process, including a little bit about the neuroscience, but mostly about the therapy. The reason we set out to do this is has to do with this. This is a statement from the VA a few years ago. It's now recognized that psychotherapy, not psychopharmacology, is the primary treatment for PTSD, even though pharmacology can help. It's the main thing is the therapy, and we have some good therapies now, but a lot of the time they don't work for everybody. At least half the people are not adequately served, I'd say. So the question we're asking, it's not a regular drug trial where we're just testing a drug. We're asking, could this drug catalyze psychotherapy as the mechanism for treatment? And
it's only given 3 times.
Yeah. So it's not a daily dose. It's a very unusual dosing regimen. Mm-hmm. One dose every month, 3 times, and that's it. Mm-hmm. This is not a new idea to use MDMA for psychotherapy. There were, between the late 70s and when it was scheduled in 85, there were quite a few psychiatrists and psychologists using it. These are some of the case reports and series that were published by very reputable people, but there were no controlled trials done. MDMA was not illegal, but it was not an approved drug either, so it didn't really have a status then. But unfortunately, they didn't do any controlled trials. You would think that based on these promising reports, a lot of money and effort would have gone immediately into research, but that didn't happen for quite a while. But we've been working on that for almost 20 years now. This is MDMA. It's been off patent since 1914. It's often called a psychedelic, which is fair if that means mind manifesting. I think that is an apt description, but it's quite different from classic psychedelics like psilocybin or LSD. And Dave Nichols has suggested a term, entactogen, meaning to touch within, referring to this quality that MDMA has of helping people connect more with their own inner process, but also connect with others, touch within others too, in a way. So it tends to increase empathy. There's often a feeling of well-being and insightfulness, and there is generally less perceived loss of control than with classic psychedelics. That's relative though, and for people with PTSD, sometimes it can be quite challenging in that way, but less so probably than psilocybin or LSD in general. The pharmacology is complex. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but it has a lot to do with monoamine release, especially serotonin and some agonism at serotonin receptors, especially 5-HT2A. Interestingly, it also causes elevations in a number of hormones, oxytocin and prolactin probably being the most interesting from a psychological point of view. So a little bit about the research. We got approval for our first protocol in 2001 from FDA, but then it took until early 2004 to get DEA and IRB approval. And then as of 2016, MAPS had sponsored 6 phase 2 clinical trials that were successful. So those led to a end of phase 2 meeting with FDA, in which we not only got permission to go into phase 3, we got breakthrough therapy designation because our phase 2 results were so promising. And we did this under special protocol agreement with FDA. This is the basic study design. It varies. This is a phase 2 design. The phase 3 is very similar without a crossover. And so going from left to right, what this shows is first, of course, informed consent, and then careful screening by psychologists and physicians that are not involved in the treatment phase of the study. Then these next 3 vertical green lines are the preparatory sessions, 3 90-minute non-drug sessions, which we think are very important to prepare people for the experience.
And to get to know people a little bit more.
Yeah.
Because a lot happens very quickly for them.
And it's part of establishing a safe mindset, a safe set and setting.
Mm-hmm.
And then the 3 green triangles are the only times the MDMA is administered, in all-day sessions with 2 therapists, and they happen about a month apart. And then you can see that the green lines after each of those triangles are what we call the integration sessions, the follow-up sessions that are also very important, because these experimental sessions can be very intense with or without MDMA. Actually, an all-day therapy session it can bring up a lot. So it's really important that people have support in integrating all that afterwards. And then you can see the primary endpoint in phase 2 was after 2 sessions. And then whatever they were randomized to for the first 2, if they got full dose, they'd go on and have an open label full dose. If they got inactive placebo or comparator dose, depending on the study, then they could go through again with the crossover. And then we had follow-up at 2 months and then a year or more. The CAPS was our clinician-administered PTSD scale, was our primary outcome measure, and we also measured these other things. There was a little variation in the phase 2 studies, and we've measured some additional things in phase 3. And, it's really important that we do careful screening. We do physical exam, lab work, EKG. If people have controlled hypertension, they have additional testing to rule out significant cardiovascular disease and or cerebral vascular disease. And we have careful psychological screening, again, by an independent rater. The most important inclusion is having adequate CAPS score. In phase 2, it was CAPS 4 of 50 or more. In phase 3, it's CAPS 5 of 28 or more, which is similar. And in phase 2, everybody had to have failed prior treatment. So we excluded primary psychotic disorder, DID, bipolar type 1, active substance use disorder, personality disorder in most of the studies, or serious medical problems. These are some of the papers published from these 6 phase 2 trials. The top 3 are the ones we did top 3 papers are about 2 of the phase 2 trials we did in Charleston. And the first one was crime-related PTSD, mostly childhood sexual abuse and rape. We did a 3.5-year follow-up in that, showing sustained benefit for at least 3/4 of the people. And then we did another similar study with veterans and first responders, mostly veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan, and found that the same method worked very well with crime-related PTSD and with combat trauma or military sexual trauma. And the other 2 papers are from the studies in Switzerland and Boulder, where there was a mixed cause of PTSD. This is, we published a number of those separately, but then last year, 2019, we published the pooled results of these 6 studies, and we found a control subtracted effect size of 0.8 after 2 sessions and 0.9 after 3. So a large effect size, even subtracting this therapy, which also had a significant effect both clinically and statistically. We had a 22-point drop in CAPS-4 with therapy only in people who had failed prior treatment, but we had a 55-point drop with the MDMA plus the therapy. And so if you look at the effect of the treatment in general, not subtracting the therapy, it's even larger, 1.9 after 3 sessions, very large effect sizes. This is the graph of the data. The top line is the control, either inactive placebo or low-dose comparator, depending on the study. And the other line is, these are the least squares mean change in CAPS-4 scores. So you can see some meaningful improvement overall in with the therapy only. The 22-point drop I mentioned was in our first study, but this is the pooled
data.
Pooled data. So, and then we did a long-term follow-up from that those pooled studies, and we found actually continued improvement 12 months later. So MDMA, importantly, like every other drug, has side effects. It reliably increases blood pressure and pulse. So that's why we screen out people with significant vascular disease. And there are a number of minor self-limited side effects that I'll show you. And of course, it can be dangerous in recreational settings. It's not to be taken lightly, but there have been some deaths with ecstasy users, which often ecstasy is MDMA, but not always. But it's actually quite rare given the number of people that reportedly take MDMA, but obviously not to be taken lightly. But what we have seen, including the clinical trials plus phase 1 and other trials done by other people, there have been no deaths or unexpected serious drug-related adverse events in any of these studies of over 1,600 people. So it seems to have a good safety profile using pure MDMA in a controlled setting with well-screened people. Those all impact the safety, of course. Because there was some concern about possible memory problems in recreational users, in the first 2 phase 2 studies, we did Neurosite Testing. Those are the 3 tests. The results were, we didn't find anything significant on any of them. I'll show you the R bands. These are, you can see 0 to 125 milligrams of MDMA baseline and after 2 sessions, and we saw no sign of any neuropsychiatric problems, memory problems, or otherwise. The most common reactions in phase 2 reported during the MDMA session were these. Those are the ones that were more common with MDMA. So these are pretty typical: increased anxiety, jaw clenching, lack of appetite, nausea. But they were self-limited. This, to give you an idea of the blood pressure elevations, this is from 2 of the phase 2 trials. And you can see I've got red boxes around the maximum values for inactive placebo and the maximum values for full dose. You can see that, not surprisingly, processing trauma, even without MDMA, causes some elevation in blood pressure and pulse, but not as much as with MDMA. But we never had to intervene in any way. It went up, it came down. No, it wasn't a problem. So the phase 3, I'll just talk to you about the phase 3 trials that we're now in. I can't give you the outcome data yet. It's not released, but hopefully will be soon. And I can tell you that the safety data is looking very good. So these are where we're doing phase 3, 13 sites in North America, 2 in Israel. And we've completed the first phase 3 trial. We're now have started the second phase 3 trial in all these sites. And we also have approval for expanded access, compassionate use in the US and Israel. That should be starting the first half of this year. Things have been slowed down by COVID, certainly, but they're still, the second phase 2 is still going.
Phase 3.
Phase 3, sorry, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
We also have started recruiting, enrolling phase 2 at some sites in Europe, and we're expecting to have phase 3 going in Europe in 7 countries by next year. So this was our special protocol agreement with FDA. In order to submit a new drug application, we needed to do 2 phase 3 trials, only 100 people in each, because our effect sizes are so large. So MAP1 is the name of the first one that's finished, but you can see the last 10 people are a different color because their dots are a different color. Because when we had enrolled everybody when COVID came, but we had only treated 90 of the people. So when stay-at-home orders came, we met with FDA and they agreed we could stop there, which is what we did. So hopefully we'll soon have the results from that, and we're in the process of enrolling and treating people in MAP2 now. So now we want to talk about the therapy more. We have a manual that's available free of charge at the MAPS website if you like details about how we approach this. It's really, we've been influenced by earlier psychedelic researchers. Stanislav Grof was one of our teachers. He was one of the foremost early LSD researchers. And so we've taken what we've learned from him and others that pioneers, and we've kind of combined it with some of our own training and experience treating trauma. So the idea is, this is where we do the sessions in Charleston. That's me and Annie with our study coordinator pretending to be a participant. And, Annie, I'm doing most of the talking at the moment just because it works better with the slides, but Annie and I have been co-therapists for all the sessions we've done, except one small study with couples. So our approach is to take a relatively non-directive approach, or what we call self-directed, directed by the patient or the client. So instead of having an agenda, the therapist having the agenda about what should happen, we take this approach to try to encourage people and encourage ourselves to be open to what is going to come for that individual. They often, we encourage them to spend part of the time focusing on their inner experience without talking. And if they're comfortable with headphones and eye shades and music, we use that. That's optional. And then we alternate those periods of encouraging them to focus inward with periods of talking to the therapist. And we think both are important. There's no schedule, predetermined schedule. It varies quite a lot. But usually, I'd say on average, it's about half and half. And I mentioned the importance of preparation and integration, really, really important. And we talk to people about this concept we learned from Stan Grof about the inner healing intelligence. And, I'm trained as a physician and scientist. That can sound a little unscientific or woo-woo. We haven't located this scanning yet. But in thinking about it, I've come to really think it's a very, very useful concept, mainly based on having seen it in action so many times again and again. But also thinking about, I did emergency medicine for 10 years before I went to my psychiatry residency in 1991. And I didn't think about it so much at the time, but, if somebody came into the ER with a gash in their arm, I didn't have any idea how to heal that. I only knew how to create favorable conditions and remove obstacles. Get the gravel out, wash it out, sew the edges close together, and then that created favorable conditions for this incredible, elegant, complex healing process. Sometimes things would get in the way, and so I had some ability to help remove obstacles, like if it's there was a foreign body or infection or not enough blood supply, I could help with that. But again, I didn't know how to heal it. So we don't think that of that as being woo-woo because we understand that process better. And also lately, I've been thinking it's kind of like immunotherapy, somewhat analogous to immunotherapy for cancer, doing something to boost the individual's innate capacity to deal with the problem.
Maybe PTSD is an impediment
to
the natural healing.
Yeah.
To look at it like that.
Good point. Yeah. But I'm sure you know this concept from cognitive processing therapy. The little couple study we did was with Candace Monson and Ann Wagner. Candace in her manual talks about PTSD is a disorder of impeded recovery. So in a way, that concept is the same as inner healing intelligence. There's a natural trajectory toward healing when people have trauma, but sometimes it gets impeded and then they have PTSD. I've always loved this quote from Irvin Yalom, a well-known psychiatrist from Stanford. And the therapist must strive to create a new therapy for each patient. We maybe take that a little further or maybe the therapist must strive to allow and encourage each patient to create a new therapy for themselves. That's kind of our approach. I made this slide when we did a training in the Netherlands a few years ago. It's a little bit like curling. We set something in motion, but then we don't touch it again. We may remove some obstacles or help it steer a little bit, influence it somewhat, but we don't go out and grab it and push it around. And, our experience has kind of really supported our thinking about why that seems to be a good idea. Of course, this sounds and is in many ways much different from usual therapy. 2 therapists, Mdma, 8-hour sessions, and that's all true. But what we notice is within that, when we take this self-directed approach, these kinds of elements that we recognize in many kinds of therapy to be important tend to arise spontaneously in varying orders and to varying degrees to each individual. So it seems to be really helpful to make not be too directive, so the person has a chance to have their own process unfold in its natural way, is how we think of it. So of course, safe, supportive settings are important in all kinds of therapy. Excuse me. We noticed that virtually, I'd say everybody ends up doing imaginal exposure at some point, revisiting the trauma and talking about it, revisiting it in their imagination. The difference between, say, prolonged exposure and our approach is we don't ever ask people to do that or tell people when they should do that. We take this approach and then it comes up. Sometimes people go right to imaginal exposure. Other times something quite different happens first and then they go there. And that seems to be a very good way to do it. Because if you were focused only on imaginal exposure, you might miss a lot of these other elements that seem to bring so much depth and breadth and richness to the therapeutic process that we see. Mm-hmm. Likewise, we don't do any formal cognitive behavioral therapy, but people virtually always notice cognitive distortions and come to realizations about what's a more accurate way of thinking about things. The transference can be really amplified by MDMA, and that's an opportunity for working with that. And along those lines, there's always a fair amount of psychodynamic processing that happens spontaneously, and it's not that the therapists never participate in this or give any direction. It's that the therapists participate in a way to support what's already happening. So if people are talking about their childhood or their family, they come in with combat trauma, for instance, as you've all seen this in all kinds of therapy. They come in with combat trauma and they start talking about their relationships and their childhood and things. And if we, instead of trying to bring them back to processing the index trauma, we think that's really valuable to have time for that too, and allow for that too at the time that it naturally arises. We bring attention to the body. We encourage people to notice their body, to let it move. So there's overlap with some somatic kinds of therapies. People often start talking about their parts, not in a pathological way, but like the normal multiplicity of the psyche. We've noticed that comes up quite a bit. And so there's sort of overlap to methods that work with that idea, things like psychosynthesis, internal family systems, voice dialogue, some overlap with those things. People often have powerful transpersonal or spiritual experiences. It happens about a third of the time with MDMA, not as often as with psilocybin. It doesn't seem to be related to outcome overall, but it seems to be very important for the individuals that have some of that. The ones that don't may do just as well with a different kind of process. And as we mentioned, the oxytocin effect and other elements of MDMA effect seems to really foster a corrective attachment experience, increasing trust, helping people feel safe with the therapist. When people with PTSD often have so much trouble with trust, that can be a really helpful part of it.
And also attachment injury from childhood.
Yeah. So, and there are often some very vivid imagery, kind of like Jungian active imagination. So all these things arise, as I say, in different combinations, in different order for different people. So to give you a little bit of a taste for it, we know that Rick showed a video, so we're not going to show that again. Rick Doblin, when he spoke to you, whoever was there for that, but we'll give you a little flavor with some quotes.
I don't know why they call this ecstasy.
So this is important. It's not just that people get blissed out and everything's fine. Usually there's some affirming positive experiences, but processing trauma tends to be painful and challenging with or without MDMA. It's just that what we're seeing for many people who couldn't process it without the MDMA, it becomes possible, but it's still challenging. So that's why the therapists are there, and that's why the preparation and integration. That's why it's embedded in a course of therapy.
Maybe one of the things the drug does is let your mind relax and get out of the way, because the mind is so protective about the injury.
And I think we're going to show you a little bit of imaging data that fits really well with that statement.
I have respect for my emotions now. What's most comforting is knowing now that I can handle difficult emotions, difficult feelings without being overwhelmed.
People said it changed my relationship to my emotions. For many people, they said, well, now that I've, for the first time, been able to talk about that and have those feelings come without being overwhelmed, since I was able to do it with the MDMA, maybe I'll be able to do it without the MDMA too. And usually they could.
Mm-hmm. It feels almost like the inner healer or the MDMA is like a maid doing spring cleaning. It's as if you thought you were cleaning before, but when you got to the things you didn't really want to deal with, you'd stick them in the attic. If you're going to clean the house, you can't skip the stuff in the attic.
That was a Marine veteran who, had tried therapy at the VA, but he just didn't want to go through with it, didn't want to continue with it. But the MDMA kind of helped him do that. And we've had some veterans say, even though my PTSD is gone, now that I see the value of therapy, maybe I'll go back to my VA therapist and see about talking about some of these other things.
Mm-hmm. I think that's the first time in my life that I actually stopped thoughts and relaxed. And when I did that, that's when I started feeling that oneness with everything, merged with the whole room, and everything just was. I've learned better how to just be.
And this was after a couple of sessions in which he processed a lot about his war experience, his trauma in Iraq. And then he came to this.
How the healing process sometimes unfolds.
Yeah. And then, but some people have had more like this kind of experience first, and then they felt, one person said, now I feel as if I have a platform to operate from. Now I can talk about the trauma. So it can happen in either order.
As interesting as the sessions are, I know from experience now that it's even more interesting what happens after the sessions when you're making connections.
So that really fits with the idea that this is a catalyst for a therapeutic process that will then continue to unfold. So why? We don't know. Our research has been mainly directed toward, is it safe and is it effective? But others are very interested in how it works. And I'm really looking forward to seeing what you discover at your center at Mount Sinai. I'm sure there's going to be a lot more coming about this, but we're not going to talk about it in detail, but I'll just touch on a few things. And I just want to mention a couple of things about neuroscience that just fit particularly well with what we actually observe in the sessions. But I want to make a bid for beware of reductionist thinking, because what I think is that this is, we can understand parts of it, but it's such a complex and rich process that we're only beginning to get a handle on. I really want to avoid being reductionist about trying to explain it, so that we can, if we want to really understand it and learn the most we can, we've got to be open. Here's some of the lines of research. This first one, Barbara Rothbaum at Emory and the Atlanta VA has finished 2 studies, one showing fear extinction. MDMA promotes fear extinction in rodents. Now she has one it does so with healthy volunteers, humans, and now she's going to proceed to study MDMA with prolonged exposure. There are a lot of ideas about how memory reconsolidation may be part of it. Maybe that when the memory comes up, suddenly, instead of it's associated with safety, and so when it's reconsolidated, maybe it has different associations. There's interesting stuff about neuroplasticity. There's also this interesting stuff about a oxytocin-dependent social reward learning period in adolescence for rodents. Don't know if it happens with people, but that could be part of it. But there, and I mentioned the augmenting the therapeutic alliance. There's still not fully understood. It has something to do with oxytocin and serotonin, but I think that's a really important part of the therapeutic effect. So just a couple of things that I said that I want to mention that fit well with what we observe. It's known that, among other things, sitting here with you, Rachel, and I know how rudimentary this explanation is. I'm not a neuroscientist, but we do know that, among other things, people with PTSD have less activity in prefrontal cortex and hippocampus, even smaller hippocampus, and increased activity in amygdala, which makes sense. We know that MDMA in healthy volunteers does the opposite in some ways, increased activity in cortex and decreased activity in amygdala. We don't have much data on people with PTSD. We have a little bit that I don't have time to go on today, but it's an interesting thing that it does some of the opposite of what PTSD does. And we think that that fits with this concept of window of tolerance or optimal arousal zone. And this is written about by others having to do with other kinds of trauma therapy. This is from Pat Ogden, this diagram. So the idea is, and a lot of you, I'm sure, are familiar with this, the idea on the vertical axis is arousal. So if you're trying to process trauma in a therapeutic way, hyperarousal is a problem because processing is disorganized. People can be overwhelmed by the emotions and they either won't do it or can't do it. Conversely, if they're not engaged enough, maybe they can talk about the trauma, but it doesn't seem to be very helpful if there's no emotional connection. So the idea is there's this optimal arousal zone, sweet spot in between where therapeutic change can happen. And what we think one way to understand MDMA is it gives people a few hours in this optimal arousal zone so they can do it in a way they haven't been before. So that's one thing that makes sense to us from a clinical observation point of view. Another is this very complex area of the way the neural networks relate to each other, and changes in resting state functional connectivity between areas. I won't go into the details here, but Robin Carhart-Harris has done a lot of that work. And this is one of his papers. He's at Imperial College London. And Robin's idea is this about relaxed beliefs under psychedelics. This paper is not about MDMA in particular. It's about 5-HT2A psychedelics. So I think it applies to MDMA. The idea being that we walk around with these overweighted prior beliefs from the cortex that influence what we pay attention to. And if we have PTSD, it's even more of a problem. I think we all have this challenge to some degree, but so Robin's idea is that suddenly there's less influence from all those cortical prior beliefs and more chance to get information from the limbic system and from outside. Mendel Kaelin, who used to be in Robin's lab, describes this as what this really translates to is it's as if you've been going down a snowy hill and there's a track that you can't turn out of. So you always take the same route with a little bit of variation maybe. So this is like new fallen snow when these changes happen, is the way the analogy Mendel uses. And I think that is very much consistent with what we see. You know, suddenly people have a new perspective. They can respond differently instead of being caught in that same old pattern of the world is a dangerous place or it must have been my fault, that kind of thing. So, thank you. Now we'd like to have time to hear from you.
Thank you very much, Michael and Annie. I'm going to, that was really good. And I encourage everybody, ask hard questions. It's okay, they'll be answered. I'm going to turn this over to Laura now to manage the Q&A.
We're used to hard questions, believe me.
Yeah, so if you'll just put your questions in the chat. I think we had one initial question about some of the demographics of people who were included in the trial so far.
Yeah, that's been a limitation. We haven't had as diverse a populations as we'd like to. It's been
in phase 2. We've started to have more in phase 3.
It's improved in phase 3. We're still challenged. There's a big effort going on to get a more culturally and ethnically diverse cohort, and a lot of that is going into getting training and encouraging more diverse group of therapists, which is another way that Mount Sinai and Bronx VA are going to help so much.
That's really important in this field.
We have a lot going on about thinking about access and equitable access. I think I'm imagining Natalie Goldberg talked about that when she was presenting, that she's part of that effort.
I think people must still be processing all of the wonderful information. I got a couple texts that the quotes were really meaningful. So it's quiet right now, but maybe I have a question. I guess if clinicians here are starting to think about like what type of patient might be like a good fit for this trial in the future, is there like a certain type of trauma or patient or like phenotype or something that you think of when you're like, oh, this would be a really good match?
Well, we don't know yet. I think there's a lot more research to do. My guess is the target population is going to broaden the more we learn, and we may find some areas where it needs to narrow. But right now, what seems clear is it doesn't matter what kind of what the cause of the PTSD is, that this method is good for a broad range of types of trauma.
And complex trauma.
Yeah, we had a lot of people with complex trauma. The average duration of PTSD in the phase 2 trials was about just under 20 years. In the first phase 3, it was 14 years. So we're not taking people with just short-term PTSD and single incident trauma. For the most part, it's been much more complex than that. But we're getting a signal. We've gotten statistically significant improvements on Beck depression scores. So there needs to be a study with depression. There's a protocol about to start in Denver and Vancouver studying eating disorders for eating disorders. And we have one of the things I'm doing at MAPS now is part of the investigator-initiated trial division. So I review all these protocols. We have more than 100 proposals for investigator-initiated trials using MAPS Mdma, and they range from tinnitus. Somebody in New Zealand is studying tinnitus, but most of it is about some other things about PTSD, but people are wanting to study a lot of other
How about healthcare workers?
Disorders.
COVID.
Yeah, so one
right?
IIT is to study people with, healthcare workers affected by working under COVID. There have been a few other preliminary trials. I actually have a few slides if we wanted to, but I don't know that we need them. Annie and I worked with Candace Monson and Ann Wagner and did a small pilot with couples using Candace's method of cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy combined with MDMA, and we embedded 2 of our kinds of MDMA sessions in a compressed course of CBCT with couples where both people got the MDMA at the same time, but only one person had PTSD. But of course, as you all know, PTSD affects the relationship so much. It's a very rich opportunity. So we had that, that's been published in European Journals, Psychotraumatology or something. Not exactly the New England Journal, but there was no control group, and it was a pilot study, but it's exciting preliminary data. We saw big improvements in CAP scores and also big improvements in relationship satisfaction.
And it was really fun to see the way couples healed just with 2 sessions of MDMA.
Yeah. And Phil,
what about questions? Is Lauren?
Well, let me answer,
keep going.
Mention a couple of Phil Wolfson and Julian Andrews studied anxiety related to life-threatening illness in a phase 2 trial in California. That was promising. Charlie Grobe, who's head of child psychiatry at UCLA, and Alicia Danforth did a study of anxiety and social anxiety and autistic results. That was promising. So there's a lot in the works. But yeah, thanks, Annie. Let's go back to comments.
Oh, we have a lot of questions now, but I wish we could stay here all day. I think the first question was by Josh, if you're able to ask your question up here.
Yes. Really admire your work. Thank you for speaking with us. I'm curious about the future of research with personality disorders. I noticed that was exclusion criteria. I work in a clinic with 9/11 rescue and recovery workers, and there's a lot of trauma and there's a lot of personality pathology. Curious about the future of that kind of research.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. I'm really glad you brought that up. We had a firefighter from the New York, a paramedic from the New York Fire Department who was at the World Trade Center, he was in the study with veterans and first responders. We didn't exclude personality disorder in our first study, and we definitely had people with personality disorders. I think, that was kind of just because we're being conservative at this stage of the research. Mm-hmm. It's not because we don't think it would be a good idea. It might take a different format. It might take a different support structure. It might take different timing. But I think that we actually have some people wanting to look at MDMA assisted therapy for borderline personality disorder. And my guess is that's going to be maybe a very, very powerful treatment for personality disorders. But
Ann Wagner's
that
going to
remains
include
to be
that in her
seen.
study, right, with CBT and MDMA
In Toronto.
in Toronto.
Yeah, so
She's got a study coming up.
if you'd like to study that, please contact us at the IIT department.
Actually, Josh, there is a study being planned now. You should talk to Lauren. We're going to be collaborating with NYU
Good.
to do a MDMA in personality disorders. Anyone who's interested in that should contact Lauren. The more people, the merrier. We already had an initial conversation.
Yeah, a lot of this is the way the FDA works is you get approval for one indication. So that's why most of our research with our limited capacity has been pointed in that direction. But we think all these other areas are very exciting possibilities for research.
Great. Thank you,
Josh.
Thanks.
Thank you. I think Garrett Deckel might be next.
My question has to do with, you mentioned that it's relatively uncommon with MDMA compared to other psychedelics, but that loss of control can happen during sessions with PTSD patients. And I'm wondering two things. One, whether you believe, and you may not have numbers to say, but whether you believe that that is in any way, the likelihood of that happening is related to the age or extent or nature of the abuse history. And also whether it's your impression that it ultimately undermines the outcome of the treatment and kind of how much, or does that depend on how the session develops?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, usually we have seen that if they're going to have some issue with loss of control, it usually is when the medicine is coming on and the amphetamine effects of the medicine feel a little bit like a panic attack. That can be disconcerting, but in the preparatory sessions, we talk about having ways to have stress inoculation, diaphragmatic breathing, so that we can help people during that time. There is sometimes a feeling of like there's a change in what's happening in their brain that feels a little bit like an edge of loss of control. But nobody has really, that usually goes away with when the good qualities of the MDMA come in, that usually goes away and it doesn't impede.
Actually, what I thought you meant was flashbacks. And I work with DID and
okay. Yeah.
I worry about, I've done a ketamine session with a patient who sort of switched and got trapped in, believing she was 6 years old and the abuse was still happening. But you don't see things like that where a flashback, they get stuck in a flashback.
Well, we had one person who did kind of go back to a age and stay like that for the rest of the session, but then came out of it the next day. Her husband was there with her and she did fine. The firefighter that was at the World Trade Center had the most severe flashbacks we'd ever seen before he had the MDMA sessions, and he never had a flashback in the session. I think usually what happens with dissociation is people get more clear about how it's happening, why it's happening, and start to look at it more and observe it more. Yeah. Yeah,
we did have one, we used to work a fair amount with DID before we did this. And we had one person in the study with veterans. She was a veteran, but she had had a lot of serious childhood abuse. And she did have very prominent dissociation anyway. And it was quite prominent during one of her MDMA sessions, especially. If you looked at her then, you'd say, oh, she actually did have DID. But it wasn't a new phenomenon. It turned out she was aware of it, but she didn't lose any memories when she was dissociated. So it wasn't to that degree, but it was very dramatic in the session.
She got really in touch with the her critical part that also was the suicidal part. Mm-hmm. So, but I mean, the good news is that she really worked through it. That was like seeing that more in that magnified way actually helped her be able to watch it from a witness state eventually. So I think some of that can happen.
That was an example of the importance of integration.
Yeah.
Because she actually had a really powerful session in other ways with some deep healing. And then at the end, she switched into this part that turned to me and said, "You think you're so fucking smart. You should have picked a better veteran. I'm never going to let her get well." So that allowed me to start to work with that.
Which was actually
part.
good that we got to work with that, you know, that had been really a hindrance.
Yeah, it was an opening. But what we found was she ultimately did really well, but her outcome measures were not, her CAPS went from like, it was 111 or something on the CAPS 4. It ended up at 89 or something at 1 year. So she was somewhat better. But what I think that meant is I'm really looking forward to when somebody studies with DID, and it probably needs a longer course, a more supportive container, but I think it has real potential.
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you for bringing that up.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I think we have Leah Waltrip next.
Hi, thank you so much for speaking. I really appreciated the talk. I wanted to ask whether or not you mentioned that there is a slight bit of an issue with recruiting more diverse participants for the study currently, and that you're training certain more diverse therapists. And I was wondering if outside of the therapists being an issue to recruit more diverse populations, if you see any sort of just unwillingness to try psychedelic assisted psychotherapy in different ethnic or racial communities?
Well, that's a really good question that we've thought a lot about. Of course, there's not a good record of white people giving experimental drugs to people of color. So it's understandable that there's a lot of skepticism. So
we're trying to incorporate more of that into our training. And also, you know, culturally, we had one person that we did the informed consent with, and then just decided that the family wouldn't be able to, he couldn't go back to his family and talk about this therapy. So I think those are some of the things that need to be in the training more, and so that we can really work with those fears and ways of being in their culture. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a big challenge. I mean, one of the IITs that we're talking to people about are people from Somaliland. And the situation there is so radically different as the medical utilization situation as well as the cultural situation. So we don't know how this would work there, but we're hoping that they will help us help them figure that out. So a lot to be learned. Thanks for bringing it up.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think since we only have a couple minutes, I'm going to synthesize a few questions. So a lot of people were asking about, I think, like how you see this treatment translating to clinical use once hopefully it's approved. People were asking about, like, do you see the need potentially for booster sessions? What might that look like? And then also, what type of providers do you think would be a good match or eligible to be providing this type of treatment?
I'm really glad you brought that up. We think there'll be, we talked to FDA about REMS, or risk evaluation mitigation strategy for the drug if it's approved. And we don't know, of course, yet what it'll be, but we think it can only be administered in clinics or centers that have proper training and facility to do it. The therapists have to be trained. And the drug will be shipped directly from manufacturer to those clinics or centers. There won't be any take-home drugs, which I think is a good idea.
There'll be more flexibility as far as the time between sessions, which I think would be good, because probably more integration, more time for integration between the sessions. From our standpoint, it would have been nice to have a longer window there.
And as far as the requirements, what we've had in all the studies, including phase 3, is that both people have to be licensed therapists. It can be master's level or any other level. And we think actually what makes sense is that they don't, going forward, we're hoping they don't have to both be licensed, that one has to be licensed and the other can be someone in training, a graduate student or a resident. So we think that makes sense. We're actually getting some pushback from FDA on one of our protocol that we have for offering MDMA to therapists who have been through the training. We're trying to get a larger one of those, and we're getting some pushback about the requirements for the therapists, whether one of them should be a PhD or MD or DO level. We don't think that makes sense. It makes it more expensive, and there's no reason why those therapists are better than master's level therapists. It could be the opposite in many cases, I think. So we're actually, tomorrow we have a formal appeal meeting with FDA about this. So we'll see, but we think what makes sense is one licensed therapist and somebody else who's suitable and a great chance for training.
Thank you. I wish we could get to all of the questions, but hopefully we'll have time at a later date to discuss. Thank you both so much for joining us.
Thank you,
Lauren.
And
thank you, Rachel.
If I wouldn't have time to do it until next week, but if people have questions they really want to get answered, maybe Lauren, you could email them to me and I could respond by email later.
Thank you so much. It's very generous. We'll definitely do that.
Michael and Annie, and also Lauren, there's a discussion group, right?
Yes.
Please.
Yeah. At 5:30 tonight, for whoever wants to come, we're going to discuss what we saw here. And then we also watched the documentary Trip of Compassion. So we're going to kind of compare and contrast and process what we learned today. So everyone's welcome to join us there.
We really appreciate how much you have trained us, Michael and Annie, and your wisdom. And it's really been important for us because in Mount Sinai, we tend to think more about the science, the neuroscience, the pharmacology, and really, even when you bring up the neuroscience of the fear and all that, it's really the science of integration that we're going to go for here, really trying to understand how such a short-term experience produces a long-term effect, and that will be our neuroscience. And I actually invite anyone from Mount Sinai to get either Lauren or me. We're planning really good stuff, and we really hope that why question, when you give a talk next year about this, you'll.
Cool. Well, you'll
be giving it.
Yeah, you'll be doing that part. But yeah, I think you've put your finger on the most exciting question. Just that. How does it cause this long-term thing? Why are they better a year later when the drug was in their body for like 40 hours a year ago?
Drugs, it sort of also backfired a few decades ago.
Yeah, right.
We got to go at it.
Learn from those lessons.
Ask the question of why. It's the same question as PTSD. Why does a short-term experience lead to such long-term transformative effects? Probably the same underlying biologic mechanisms.
Yeah.
And so we're perfectly well poised to be able to do that science, especially since you have demonstrated that it works so robustly. It's really worth the effort.
Yeah, I'm excited to see what you figure out, because I'm sure you will. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much.
Bye. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone.